Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm your lecturer Tahir Ali Khan of KUST Hangu campus, and today we'll begin our study of Shakespeare's Hamlet. In the first two lectures, we'll try to explore the concept of tragedy and how Shakespeare explores human suffering through his tragedies, followed by 4 lectures on the different issues raised in Hamlet. Let's imagine you've gone to the theatre to see Shakespeare's King Lear. In the course of the play, you've seen an old man driven to madness by the cruelty of 2 of his daughters, a young man reduced to a filthy, homeless beggar by the treachery of his own brother, and an old man having his eyes gouged out, on stage no less, because his son has betrayed him to his enemies. And that's just a conservative summary of the play's horrors. At the very end of the play, the author turns the screw again.
One of the villains, Edmund, has ordered the murder of Lear's loving daughter Cordelia, almost on a whim, and Edmund's last-minute repentance comes too late to save her. The old king enters carrying his dead daughter, crazed with grief, as the other people on stage, stunned by this new atrocity, try to make sense of what is happening.
Lear cradles his child and says, "No, no, no life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? Thou'lt come no more. Never, 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 never." An unanswerable question, an unspeakable grief, language to tear your very heart out. I've just given you a very small taste of one of Shakespeare's tragedies. What does this have to do with what I'm offering you? I hope to offer interpretations or mappings of Shakespeare's tragedy in general and Hamlet in particular that will interest you and excite you. I'm going to do my darnest to make Shakespeare's language come alive for you, but at the same time, I'm not claiming to give you the final word on the play. I hope that in your own reading, you'll find there is room for your insights, your own discoveries, and that if you go to see any of them in performance at any time, you'll find yourself reimagining them in yet more ways. Because if there is one truly wonderful thing about Shakespeare, it is his capacity to keep surprising his audience. I'll offer you one journey through the play's complexities, but there will always be territory left to explore.
Since this course is about the Shakespearean tragedy Hamlet, we might want to start by asking, what is this 2400-year-old fascination in the writers and audiences in the West with watching reenactments of terrible human suffering, and in particular the painful expression of someone whom we label a tragic protagonist?
The earliest discussion of tragedy is to be found in Aristotle's Poetics around the 4th century BC. Aristotle's account of tragedy was based on the drama of ancient Athens at the time, the work of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus, plays like Oedipus Rex or Medea. He defines tragedy as a self-contained action of a certain grandeur and scope written in a language that is more elevated, more concentrated than colloquial speech. Its plot will involve dramatic reversals. Shakespearean examples would be Hamlet thinking he's killed Claudius and finding he's killed Polonius, Laertes thinking he's set things up to kill Hamlet in the duel scene and being killed by his own poisoned weapon. Its protagonist will experience some kind of climatic moment of recognition or anagnorisis, and it will evoke certain emotions in the audience. Aristotle labels them pity and fear, even as it brings about the purgation. The Greek word is catharsis of those emotions. Its heroes are usually elevated by rank or ability over most other people without being paragons of perfect virtue, but their fall or suffering is the result of what Aristotle terms hamartia, an error in action rather than pathological vice or depravity. I'd particularly like to emphasize that it is more useful to think in terms of an error in action rather than to use a phrase that may be familiar to you, the tragic flaw. The tragic flaw soundbite has dogged discussion of tragedy ever since a critic called A.C. Bradley mistranslated the Aristotelian term hamartia. If you discuss tragedy only in terms of the character flaws of one individual, you may ignore his or her relationship to the social forces and cultural practices of the larger world in which he or she must act. The particular crisis of a tragic protagonist is the product of an extreme combination of external and internal forces, and it isn't always an ostensible flaw that is their undoing. In a difficult and corrupt world, they can be undone by qualities that might be considered virtues. Aristotle speaks not only to the ideal content of tragedy, but of the effect it should have on its audience. It should evoke pity and fear. It shouldn't simply upset and disgust. It should create a kind of empathy between audience and characters, and particularly between audience and the tragic protagonist. And this notion of catharsis suggests that the audience will be changed by the experience, will undergo some kind of purgation of the emotions that have been aroused by the play, will have their own assumptions about human experience modified by the play. Keep thinking about this double scenario. What happens to the people in the play? What happens to us as we experience the play? Do we necessarily feel the same things as the play's protagonist? Is our vision completely continuous with his or hers? Does that character necessarily learn the same things we learn from seeing the action as a whole? Tragedy in performance does not reappear in Europe until the 16th century. Before this, in medieval Europe, the term tragedy is often used not to describe drama, but to describe a certain kind of narrative. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, one of Chaucer's pilgrims, the monk, relates a series of stories which he describes as tragedies, and he defines tragedy as follows. To speak of tragedy is to speak of a certain story, as old books remind us, of one who was in a position of great prosperity and who has fallen from high degree into misery and ends wretchedly. The monk's short tales involve biblical mythological figures as well as people from history, and they suggest that for medieval readers, tragedy is simply the story of a fall from greatness to wretchedness. This version of tragedy focuses on human beings' vulnerability to the caprices of fortune, and this kind of tragedy suggests the Christian moral that one should scorn transient earthly pleasures and glories and trust in higher things, the rewards of virtue in the hereafter. Let's move on a couple of hundred years. Although 16th century writers were aware of Aristotle's ideas, their theories of tragedy were even more influenced by the plays of a Roman writer, Seneca. Some centuries after Aristotle, the Romans wrote tragic dramas in partial imitation of the Greeks, and those written by Seneca were frequently read and translated in 16th and 17th century England. Seneca's works are highly rhetorical, full of moral speeches, and preoccupied with death and revenge, but it is not clear whether Seneca's plays were meant for public performance or just for private reading. When the English writer Philip Sidney defines tragedy in his defense of poesy, he speaks of the high and excellent tragedy that openeth the greatest wounds and showeth forth the ulcers that are covered with tissue, that maketh kings fear to be tyrants, that with stirrings the effects of admiration and commiseration teacheth the uncertainty of this world, and upon how weak foundations gilded roofs are builded. Sidney's ideas show a mix of influences. He calls tragedy a high and excellent form. This recalls Aristotle's idea that its action must be of a special magnitude. He suggests its horrors are justified because it exposes hidden vice. It is a didactic form. It discloses the corruption that rulers and statesmen may attempt to conceal. His image is one of ulcerated skin, masked by tissue. Tragedy makes kings fear to be tyrants. He follows the suggestion we often see in educational treatises of the Renaissance that in mirroring nature, art can move people to virtuous action with its stirring or admonitory examples. Finally, he suggests that tragedy in provoking admiration teacheth the uncertainty of this world and upon how weak foundations gilded roofs are builded. His remark starts out with an approximation of Aristotle's theory of tragic effect. Admiration and commiseration are somewhat equivalent to terror and pity, but he ends on a medieval note Tragedy shows the fragility of earthly splendors. Now these are some of the ways in which tragedy had been defined before Shakespeare wrote his major plays. As you can see, tragedy is not a stable term. It's always being renegotiated, and Shakespeare himself never writes a theory of tragedy. He just writes tragedies. We don't know if he ever read Aristotle or, for that matter, Sidney, although many commentators have in their turn constructed their theories of what constitutes Shakespearean tragedy. I'm going to give you a provisional list of some of the commonplaces about Shakespearean tragedy. 1. Shakespeare's tragic heroes tend to be elevated by rank and or ability above the common herd. They are princes or warriors. Notice the gender assumptions here. The idea that the tragic protagonist is in fact a tragic hero, not a tragic heroine. 2. They often exist in a state of alienation from their own society. Their experiences or the consequences of choices they've made tend to create their estrangement from ordinary human beings. 3. The fall of the tragic protagonist tends to have a larger significance. It is not just one person coming to grief, but may have reverberations within a whole community. 4. Tragic protagonists generally reach some kind of recognition of the problematic choices they have made or the destructive actions they have engaged in. They may claw out of their pain and horror a kind of insight which allows them to find some universalizing and higher significance in their experience and suffering. This not only links their individual passions to a larger notion of the human condition, but gives us a vision of a world where significance or wonder or even a meaningful terror can be won from the chaos of life. Finding meaning in what is horrible or fearful, this last is particularly tempting vision for audiences at any time. The last 100 years have given us the spectacle of a world which is still for many people one of hideous cruelty. Think of the victims of ethnic cleansing. Think of the genocide in Bosnia. Think of 9/11 and the ongoing violence in Middle East. Going further back, think of the victims of Hitler or Stalin, or the literally millions of soldiers who died in the trenches in the World War I. One might well be tempted to ask what kind of human beings could allow these horrors to happen, given that we seem to be stuck in a nasty, brutal, ignoble little world. It is not surprising that people have tended to value works of art which attempt to extract some kind of meaning out of human suffering. But be aware that Shakespeare's contemporaries don't speak of this kind of agenda. It is later writers who have insisted that death and suffering are transcended in Renaissance tragedy because a particular vision of human nobility escapes or survives or transcends the horror of the action. These commentators would argue that the art of tragic dramatist is to be cherished because it puts human suffering into words and make it signify. We may wish to ask if this insight is achieved by the characters who participate in the tragic action of a particular play, or whether it is retrospectively constructed by us, the audience. Now, I've just outlined for you the commonplaces which occur again and again in discussions of Shakespearean tragedy. Shakespeare wrote 6 major tragedies between 1600 and 1608. Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, Antony and Cleopatra, and Coriolanus. During this stage of his career, Shakespeare seems to focus with a particular intensity upon profound human dilemmas, upon the difficulties of enacting choice and moral agency in a corrupt world, in exploring certain experiences which test the very limit of language. These are not the only tragedies Shakespeare wrote. We have, for example, the very early Titus and Andronicus, the bloodiest play he ever composed, and also, of course, another earlier play, the much-loved Romeo and Juliet. Why am I ignoring Romeo and Juliet? Not because it is not a fine and moving drama, but as a tragedy, it doesn't quite fit with the works Shakespeare was to write later in his life. Its star-crossed lovers are largely the victims of forces external to themselves, the caprices of fortune and circumstance. They are very young people who love impulsively, not adults wrestling with impossible choices or agonizing over their actions. Another earlier tragedy, which I find difficult to put in the same box as the tragedies, is Julius Caesar. Its complicated engagement with Roman history disperses the focus of tragic attention. Caesar, its nominal protagonist, dies in Act 2. The dilemmas of Brutus, his deeply ethical assassin, get a fair bit of attention, but must share center stage with the machinations of Cassius and with the political maneuvering of Mark Antony and Octavius. The historical vision it offers is shot through with tragedy, but not defined by tragedy. Furthermore, as it ends, the seeds of a new conflict are germinating between the victorious survivors. Shakespeare returned to the aftermath of this play to write a work in which tragedy rather more conclusively stakes its own claims over history. That play is Antony and Cleopatra. In considering the very particular universe that Shakespeare creates, we need to stress the importance of state and social politics in his plays. Tensions they explore between the will and desires of the individual and the constraints emanating from his or her society, the relationship between public and private life. Shakespearean tragedy involves complicated negotiations of power and the different kinds of power under investigation. Political power, the power of language and imagination, the power of theatre itself. The play is the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. There's also the little matter of the ways in which Shakespeare's characters imagine powers beyond humanity. Is there providence in the fall of a sparrow, as Hamlet declares, or do the gods kill us for their sport, as the Earl of Gloucester despairingly remarks in King Lear? Shakespearean tragedies are family matters and the pressures of kinship. Protagonists are differently positioned in the familial structure. Hamlet is defined primarily as a son, Macbeth and Othello as husbands, King Lear as a father. We can say a lot about agency, about who does or does not get to act or to reflect upon their actions in the imaginative space of these plays. We might indeed think of transgression as being coterminous with tragic action. What constitutes transgression in these plays? What does it mean in different worlds and different contexts? To overstep the boundaries of permitted action, to challenge the norms of one's society, to put oneself beyond the pale. Why do we find that moment so compelling? This may be linked to questions concerning gendered action in the plays. Finally, we'll consider that whole business of tragic knowledge and insight won out of suffering that I've mentioned before. What kind of significance do Shakespeare's protagonists find in their own suffering? To conclude, a few words about the business of reading Shakespeare. Many students sort of whine a bit about the difficulty of Shakespeare's Old English. This is Old English. Huet vega dena in Gjordagum Theod Kininga Trim Gefrunun. That's the beginning of Beowulf. It's not what Shakespeare writes. Then we have the Middle English. When that April with his shoe Rasuta the drocht of March had Persit to the Ruta. That's the very beginning of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It's not what Shakespeare writes. Let me just give you a little taste of what Shakespeare does write and invite you as I pronounce what is officially modern English. Just listen and note mentally any words of which you don't recognize the meaning. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow creeps in this petty pace from day to day in the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have guided fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle, life's but a walking shadow. Poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That soliloquy of Macbeth's, in fact, doesn't contain a single word that isn't in common use today. We have to admit that Shakespeare uses some words which are now archaic or whose nuances have shifted somewhat. He also has a vocabulary about 3 times as large as the most articulate of us. The lexicon of his complete works is about 25,000 words. His syntax is occasionally more compressed or elliptical than ours. He is very culturally literate and his range of illusion is daunting, which is why it is important that you read a good edition with glosses and footnotes. I personally recommend Ardent Shakespeare. Shakespeare also, of course, writes plays which are largely, although by no means wholly, written in poetry in blank verse, that unrhymed verse in the 5-beat lines we call iambic pentameter. Many people have a fear of poetry. Some will say things like, I really love literature except that I don't like poetry. Poetic language seems to mean for these people extra words, hidden meanings, superfluous ornament, frills, static. It is language under pressure, often bound by certain patterns or rhymes, which don't hamper communication so much as discipline it. Shakespeare's poetic language is one whose apparent ornament and superfluities can actually offer the most economic, most precise way of saying something or conveying a complex effect that appeals both to the intellect and to the emotions. Macbeth could have said, life's a bitch and then we die, but his poor player, his tale told by an idiot, is a far more suggestive way of conveying what he wants to say about existence. So far we have talked in this first lecture on Shakespeare about how we might define tragedy and what seem to be some of the particular preoccupations of Shakespearean tragedy. We have not yet addressed the very specific historical context in which Shakespeare was writing his plays. My next lecture will focus upon the experiments in writing tragic drama that were taking place in the 16th century when Shakespeare's career began and that offered him his own literary springboards. We will also glance at the social and political history of the early 17th century when the major tragedies were written, both the big issues of the day and the more everyday preoccupations of Shakespeare's audience. Shakespeare's tragedies often unfold in geographically distant places or are set in a far-off past, but they are often shaped and influenced by matters surprisingly close to home, but more on that subject next time.